Well, it was January 28th, 2013, in my first year as police chaplain, that I got a call at 5 o'clock that evening. There had been a double fatality in Marietta on Route 441, and they needed a chaplain. Actually, they needed several. I was one who was called out that night. It was a cold, dreary night. And when I arrived on the scene, there was the usual, the police cars and the ambulances and fire trucks and the lights and all the kind of chaos that goes along when this kind of event happens. When I found the officer in charge who I needed to report to that I was there, when I found him, I asked him if he had any names. There was two people, as I said, who had been killed in the accident. And when I found him, I asked him if he knew the names. He said yes. And I've got permission from the family to use these names. He said one was Darlene Crick. When he said that name, my heart went from here down to here because this was a lady who I knew. She was the sister of a friend of mine and the family. In fact, her sister was married to a man, and his name was Nick, who I'd walked with him for a year through his journey with cancer until he died. And we had married a couple and had a wedding for them. And I baptized him after he became a Christian after doing my journey with him. And so I now needed to go along with a police officer to make a death notification. We went first to her boyfriend, who at the time she was living with him, and we went to notify him. The next logical person that seemed appropriate for us to make the death notification to was Dar's sister, Amanda, who was at that time Nick's widow. And so I went and picked up my wife along with a police officer. We went to her home to notify her of the death of her sister. Her sister had raised her, and so they were very close to each other. And I dreaded going. It was one of the hardest death notifications I think I've done. And when we notified her, she sat on the floor in shock for a long time, didn't know what to say. It was such a blow. And after a while, others in the family began to come. See, this was very personal to me because these had become my friends. People I had, some who I had led to Jesus, others who I had befriended and learned to love as people in my community. We spent some time, my wife and I, that evening, several hours, praying with this family and just trying to comfort them. In fact, they asked for prayer before I offered it because they didn't know what else to do and said, "Can you pray for us?" And so we gathered in a circle in the room and we prayed together that night. When I met with the family to plan the funeral, as they asked me to have the funeral, in the planning I offered our church for the service because it was going to be a large funeral. She was well known in the community. She was a biker, and she had a lot of biker friends, and they were all going to show up. And so offered the church and offered our basement for a fellowship meal afterwards. They decided to have the fellowship meal somewhere else. But when we were finished planning, Dar's brother, who was there, said to me, he said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "People don't do this kind of thing anymore. Why are you being so kind to us?" And I had a wonderful opportunity to explain to them, it's because we love Jesus and we love you. And that's why we're doing this. And so we were able to bring a certain level, as much as you can in a situation like that, peace into a very chaotic situation. Penn State and the FBI have collaborated to write a little brochure called Coping with Grief, and I'd like to read just a statement from that brochure. It's intended to give to families during times like this. It says, "Nothing in life can prepare you for the sudden and traumatic death of a loved one. No one expects this to occur. People who experience trauma have a wide range of reactions. These reactions may feel abnormal and strange. You may feel like something is wrong with you and that the terrible pain will never cease." See, it's into this terrible world of terrible pain and trauma that a police chaplain and often an accompanying police officer step when you do a death notification. You never know how people will react. Sometimes it's with shock, like my friend. Other times it's sobbing and tears. Other times it's extreme emotions. And sometimes it's even with certain level of violence. The police departments that we serve, there's 12 of us chaplains who serve 4 police departments. And so we're on call every 6 weeks, all week long. They tell us that when the chaplains appear, the level of anxiety and stress just kind of goes lower. And so the officers love this program, and they love when the chaplains show up because they sense that something happens when we come, because they can do their job and we can tend to the families and love on the families and care for them and pray for them while they do what they need to do. But it's not always the case that it lowers the tension. I remember a drug overdose about a year or so ago. Happened at home. A mother found her son dead in bed one morning when she woke up from a drug overdose. And so the police called and requested a chaplain. And I was on call that week. And while the police and the coroner were doing their work, the family became increasingly agitated. This was a family that had some run-ins with the police before, and so they were just a bit unsettled by the police in their home and doing the investigation. They thought it wasn't going fast enough and whatever. And when it came time to remove the body from the house, the police requested that they go into another room so that they could remove the body without the family seeing the body bag being carried out of the house. But they refused to do so. And the police officer kept insisting. And they kept refusing and getting louder and louder. And finally, the officer said to me, "You take half of them, and I'll take a half of them. I'll go in this room, and you go in that room." And in the middle of much shouting and protesting, we finally were able to kind of shepherd them into rooms and close the door so the body could be carried out of the house. The more we stayed and the longer we stayed there, the more agitated they became. And it was very difficult after the police left for me to have a prayer like I normally like to do before I leave, with the agitation and the shouting, and to try and have prayer with them. I find that suicide and drug overdoses, as I mentioned, are the most difficult. I remember another suicide in Marietta. After when the police called me and went to the family, met them at the kitchen table, we sat around the kitchen table and just talked about the deceased. They had lots of questions. What do you do with the body? Where do we go? You got to know a funeral home. How do we plan a funeral? We don't know how to do that. I find that a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking about those kinds of things. And when these kind of things happen, they have a lot of questions. Well, I decided to go to the viewing a few days later because I felt like I had developed some sort of a relationship with the family. And 5 months later, I got this wonderful thank you card in the mail from the wife of the husband who had committed suicide. And she says to me, and I had tears in my eyes as I read this, it says, "Thank you for your words of comfort and guidance at my house after the death of my husband. You were a calming presence during a day that made no sense and seemed surreal on so many levels. I was very appreciative to see you again at my husband's funeral. That meant a lot to me, that you came by to give your condolences and support us once again. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm reading this letter, I don't know what I did. Except that all I can understand is presence and caring and comfort like that at times like this can be very powerful in bringing peace into a situation. And she realized that and she sensed that. In one drug overdose, a young man was found dead in the bathroom in Turkey Hill in Colombia. Police called me at 1:30 in the morning and asked me to go along with them to wake up his mother and notify her that their son had been found dead. Can you imagine what it's like for a mother to be waked up in the middle of the night and your son is dead from a drug overdose? She told me that her son was about to go into a rehab center and that her worst fear was that she would get a call just like she had of us coming to notify her. I prayed with her, and I left my card, a church card, and several days later, her friend called me and asked me if I would do the funeral for them. They didn't have a pastor; they didn't know where to look, and so they asked me if I would do the funeral. And so again, I had an opportunity to go and share the love of Jesus with this family. And after it was over, she came up to me and gave me a big hug and said, "Thank you. That's just what I needed today." And several weeks ago, I was at a drug addiction meeting, and she was there and told the story of her son and how he had died. And I was so proud of her because she had the courage to tell that story of the shame that she felt that night, but she had the courage to tell that story of her son. But there's another area of chaos other than those who are victims, and that's, for me, is a personal chaos. My first year as chaplain, I had 8 death notifications that first year. All the other chaplains, I think I had almost all of them that year. Just happened that I was on call. Each time there was a notification. And many of them were traumatic situations. The violent collision I talked about later, several suicides, one the father of several young children. Another was the stepson of my wife's coworker. That happened on the same day that my friend Nick died. And so I tended to that family go home and get a phone call and said, "Nick Stein, can you come?" What do you say to parents when that happens? We didn't say much. We just stood out in the yard and hugged each other and cried with them and prayed as much as we could. And we didn't know what else to do. But several weeks later, when they wanted to have the burial service, they invited us to be there and participate in the burial service. There was other calls. A lady who died in a house fire in Elizabethtown. And I knew some of the people that attended the funeral. I was invited the police invited me to come to there, and the family was distressed. And so I met with them, and we had the media was there, and we had to stand kind of to protect them from the media with our backs to them so that they couldn't be taking pictures and filming the family in this moment of pain. And then I had the funeral. Several of my biker friends who had I had ministry with earlier were there and were part of that. I had an opportunity again just to minister to those guys as well. That first year was very difficult for me, as I said. Not only were several notifications for people I had connections with, but at the time I was also recovering from 2 stem cell transplants for cancer. And I began to notice that I was slipping into depression and beginning to show some signs, I thought, of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I sought the help of a professional and talked to him for a while. And my congregation was kind enough to give me 6 weeks of relief from pastoral ministry, at least from preaching, so that I could recover and heal. I find sometimes as a healer, you can become the wounded, and you too need help for yourself. Another place of chaos in the police chaplaincy work is with the officers themselves. Actually, our program was designed to be a major resource for the police officers and to support them, give them a safe place to talk. Many of them are ex-military personnel. Some of them may be experiencing some PTSD from coming back from a battle in places like Afghanistan or wherever. And they project a tough exterior, but inside they're vulnerable just like the rest of us. And so our requirement is that when we're on call is that we ride with an officer for like 2 hours during that week. And so it's amazing what an officer will begin to talk about when you're locked in a car with him for 2 hours. And he wants to keep a conversation going. And so you'll talk about his family, you'll talk about his wife, he'll talk about what's happening at home, he'll tell you about his kids, he wants to talk about God, he wants to talk about church, and they even sometimes want to talk about things they wouldn't tell anybody else when you're riding with them. And it's amazing what they begin to talk about. So we get to pray for them and encourage them. So I've changed my opinion of police officers. Before I entered this program, I always thought they were kind of arrogant and like to throw their weight around and were aloof. And some of you, I'm sure, have that same opinion. But I've changed that because I've discovered that these are people who love their community and care about their community. And many of them are people who love Jesus. And we need to pray for them and support them. So people ask me, why do I do this? What made you decide to be a police chaplain, and why do you do it? When the opportunity first came for me to serve in this way, I really struggled with whether or not to accept. As a non-resistant Anabaptist, I wondered, was this appropriate? I remember a former a bishop and school teacher, some of you would know who it is if I told you his name. He would, I remember him saying several times, there's two careers that Mennonites shouldn't participate in. One is the military and one is a police officer because they carry weapons and there's a potential for violence. So that was in the back of my head as I was trying, and I struggled with that for several months, and I prayed about it. And finally, God gave me the peace after several months of wrestling. I came to believe that God was calling me to this ministry, and I came to a place of peace about it. Never once have I regretted it. It's one of the most rewarding things I've done in 36 years of ministry. Which brings me to the why. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, "But thanks be to God who always leads us as captives in Christ's triumphal procession and uses us to spread the aroma of the knowledge of him everywhere. For we are to God the pleasing aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one we are an aroma that brings death, to the other an aroma that brings life." And Paul says, and who is equal to the task? I agree with Paul. Who is equal to the task? But as chaplain, I have the opportunity to bring the aroma of Christ into the lives of those who are being saved and those who are perishing, and to be a part of God's transforming death into life. Who is equal to such a task?